Hi, I'm Glenn Parry, and welcome to Case Study Research. This talk forms part of the Qualitative Case Study Research lecture, which forms part of the Qualitative Methodology module. The aims of this seminar is to look at what is case-based research, how does it build theory, when do we use it, and certain analysis techniques, and we'll try and apply some of what we learn. By the end of the session, you should understand the basics of what a case study is, appreciate the benefits of the methodology, understand the limitations, really try and understand where and how to use it, and also some analysis options so you could start to do case study research yourself. So you've started collecting your data, but really you need to think about writing up your research. Let's look at the different ways we write up and how important it is to start writing up now. So we've been through the process and the analysis. Let's just end with some thoughts on the quality of the work. So how do you target your study? Give initial thought to where you will publish. Does your target journal often accept case studies, or is it a quantitative journal, or is it a modelling journal? If so, case studies not for you. Is there in your target publication a number of case studies and one that's similar to what you want to do that you can use as a model? Who's the audience? Because obviously I've been speaking extensively about journal papers, but actually you might do a case study that your target is actually the public or policymakers who have different interests and preferences. So you've got to think of how are we going to do this so it meets different audiences' need. If you've written an academic paper, you may consider a public version for non-specialists. What exactly would you put in that to make it more accessible? Can you clearly communicate why the study is representative? Are you going to represent and communicate the information about the phenomenon in a clear and crisp way for an academic journal, or is it going to be a more easily consumed presentation for the public? Arguments made, you can do pictures, process charts, graphs. You can support the claims you make with quotes. And these are all ways to make the argument clearer. But it's all about targeting your audience correctly and making sure the way you're producing and structuring your work is fit for the right audience. So structure. Most common academic work follows a very linear analytical structure. You outline an issue, you provide literature, method, case study, discussion, conclusions, future work. This approach may include some of the others below, but our approach from academia is normally finding the propositions in literature that frame a research question, and then the method helps you address the research question. You explain the case, You then discuss it in light of the literature, which leads to conclusions and then future work. You might have comparative structures, which involve repeating the case multiple times from different perspectives. So if you compare alternative descriptions or explanations, perhaps. For example, if you were looking at Brexit, is it good or bad? And is it responsible for the 2023 tomato shortage? You could argue for and against Brexit as an explanation. Those are rival explanations. Chronological structures present the case in linear time, but disproportionate attention is usually given to earlier events and not enough to later ones. To balance that out, often you might consider writing your case study in reverse. So you start with the more recent things and then write the older ones afterwards. That might help balance the focus. Theory building structures follow the logic of theory or framework in the narrative of the case. I've also written papers like this where I have a theoretical framework and I structure the case following that theoretical framework. It's very different from chronological or simple narrative, but it explains how my case research fits to the theoretical framework we built. Suspense structures and presents the findings and then explains it. So this suspense idea is, this is what we found and then this is how we found it. Unsequenced structures refer to the presentations of findings where the order can be changed and it doesn't really alter the descriptive value. It's when you've almost got a module structure for the case study where you can speak about it in chunks and you can mix them around, and it's relatively unstructured. Start writing now is some very good advice. You can start on the literature reviews immediately, write as you go with fully automated referencing. It's very difficult if you find a little gem in a paper and you don't write it down in references. It's very difficult to find it again later and it'll haunt you at night. Methodology can also be drafted as procedures should be decided on in the protocol and the design. So you can start drafting your methodology, and also you can pull bits from the literature review because you'll get ideas from, oh, I see this paper's got a case. That's given me more ideas for my method, and that can evolve. You can draft descriptives of the cases as you proceed. I think that's a very good idea. It engages you more deeply in the cases that you're working on. If you are producing images, graphs, process charts, create them as you go and share them maybe if it's appropriate with your research design, so people can go, oh yeah, I've missed a bit from mine because I can see that in somebody else's. Any early writing will reveal potential problems with your design protocol, gaps in data or theory that you can address now. If you don't start writing now, you'll only hit problems later on and it'll be much more difficult to go back and resolve. So we've been through the process and the analysis. Let's just end with some thoughts on the quality of the work. So a number of steps can be taken to ensure quality in case study research. Firstly, you need to review your material to validate the case. Have that done by peers, but by participants and informants. Now, the people you ask may disagree with the interpretations and conclusions you draw, but they should not disagree with the underlying facts, what you found out in your case study work. Now, the exemplary case is significant because it's making a contribution, it's of interest, and it's important in terms of theory. It is complete because the boundaries of the case are clearly stated, the evidence has been exhaustively collected, and any key limitations or conditions are absent from the work. You cannot say, oh, I ran out of time or I couldn't get access, because we're looking to contribute to theory or knowledge. If that is the case, you need to redesign to adapt your cases. You've got to consider all the alternative perspectives. If they're rival theoretical propositions, you need to make sure they can be dismissed through analysis. If they're alternative perspectives or interpretations of the facts, you've got to make sure that they can be empirically rejected. How do you do that? Well, often you need sufficient evidence so that you can reject alternative perspectives and provide readers the confidence that you really understand what's going on. And finally, it's really going to be well written. If you write an engaging style with clarity and really show your evidence, then we can have a high quality case that is convincing to the reader. I want to reiterate the absolute importance of theory. You need to have a thorough grasp of theory before any data collection for case studies. Your research questions and propositions are embedded in theory. What does theory propose, and what are you proposing as a result? And therefore, what research questions drive the tests of those propositions? All of that's theoretical, and you can't really go and get any benefit from a company without really understanding what lens you're going to be looking at it through. So your PhD must make an original contribution to knowledge. You need to know what's been done and identify knowledge gaps. That's quite hard because when we're looking at literature, we're actually trying to see what's not there. So again, you've got to have a thorough grasp of theory before you can start to see, that's missing. Theory development is part of the design phase. You design your study to fill those knowledge gaps. What's the underpinning theoretical basis of the work? Are you seeking to develop or test theory or extend theory? Literature provides you with the theoretical framework and likely the methodological frameworks, because you'll be reading those papers and you'll see the methods that are being used. Existing knowledge bases can be very poor. Lack of literature is usually due to new context, not novel theory. So I've been doing a lot of work recently in blockchain, but often what we see can be explained with previous theory. So all we have is a new context, not new theory. That's a challenge, because if I were to write about it, often it's really just journalism. This has happened, but we know why. It's easier to get a PhD by building on others' work than trying to establish a new field. And if you try and do that, where are you going to publish? So make sure you know your theoretical basis, try and spot the gaps, understand the propositions and test them. So having collected our data, let's consider case study data analysis. Analysing data is difficult and you're going to need a strategy. Case study data analysis is an undeveloped area. It's hard. You need a plan, which should be in your protocol, which is why we developed the protocol first. If you collect data first, you'll struggle to analyse it. It's really not going to work for you. So what are the tools, formulas, etc. that can help? Well, NVivo is a great tool to help code text and then manipulate that text to show themes and trends. Word clouds, if you've got a bunch of data, you can drop it into a word cloud tool and it'll show you the recurrent themes. Text quantification can be used to show patterns, so repeated words, repeated phrases. Making matrices of the categories that you see, or placing evidence in the boxes of those matrices is useful. Visualizations, graphs, charts show you what's happening. Display information in chronological order or other logical schemes that you make up. Again, are good ways of showing you how things are done. These days, I used to use NVivo. I do tend to use Excel spreadsheets because that allows me to manipulate it, but it does require you to be pretty good at flying Excel along. So NVivo is a good place to start if you're not really good at using Excel. So 3 general strategies. Firstly, when you're analysing your data, rely on the theoretical propositions. This is a strategy I advise. Design of the case is based on theoretical propositions that you found in literature and reflected on in the research questions. Findings should support, challenge or create new propositions based on what went before. So really you've got a proposition that something explains whatever it is that you're looking at, and then when you find your evidence, it should either support it and say yes, I find the same thing. It should say no, I found something else, or it could, and from that you can then work and say, well, I found the same thing in this new context, or I found it and there's a slight addition to explain something further, or I don't find support for it, and then you've got to find the reason why. You can examine rival propositions. And then you can define and test the multiple explanations for why something's happening. This links to theoretical propositions, but requires use of competing or rival hypothesis or theory to explain why what you're seeing is happening. So you can then look at it in multiple ways and decide what the true explanations are. Data collection needs to include sources that challenge or support the rivals. Though really, you should be doing this anyway, because if you try and publish something and there is a rival explanation you haven't thought about, then you can often guarantee that one of the reviewers will know about it and your work will not get published. You can develop a case description. A descriptive framework can sometimes unlock insight into a case through causal links. Descriptive case structure may be chronological, geographic, lifestyle, or other narrative. However you're telling the story, you're really describing in detail what you found in your case. I really like case descriptions as well. I find them really informative. And often if you start with a case description, you can unlock ideas as to what the theoretical underpinning might be, if that's the way your work is developed. If you want to look at specific analytic techniques, well, I always direct people to Miles and Huberman's book, Qualitative Data Analysis by Sage. It's a great source of many different techniques. I'll also suggest looking for proxy papers in your target journal that perhaps have similar theoretical grounding or goals, and see what techniques they've employed. Yin provides 5 potential techniques for you to consider: pattern matching, explanation building, time series analysis, and logic models. Those are applicable to single or multiple cases. And then cross-case synthesis, obviously that's only applicable to multiple cases. Pattern matching is a common way of analysing data. What you do is you compare a theoretically predicted pattern or sequence with empirical data. If patterns match, you have confirmatory evidence, strengthening your internal validity. If this is explanatory, patterns may relate to dependent or independent variables. Now, non-equivalent dependent variables as a pattern, what that means is an experiment or quasi-experiment may have multiple non-equivalent dependent variables. That's a fancy way of saying you've got a variety of outcomes. You need to identify the precedents, that is what comes before patterns that give specific outcomes, and rule out alternative patterns or rival explanations to make your causal inference. Again, what does that mean? It means you look at what came before, what pattern emerges in the data, and your theory needs to explain, right, if this comes before, you get that pattern. If there are any other explanations, it's not valid. If an outcome isn't as predicted, you've got to revisit the theory, the explanation of why that pattern is the way it is. To really do this, you need replication. You might have theoretical replication or literal replication. So you're doing the same thing over again, ideally across multiple cases, because that aids the validity of your study. It shows that actually this is true. Key is to look for nuance, which are subtle differences. Are the cases or examples you're choosing truly the same? Any difference can lead to alternative patterns. So if they've got differences in there, you're not going to get the same pattern anyway. You might have rival explanations of patterns. The aim here is to develop rival theoretical propositions that you articulate in operational terms. If one explanation of a phenomenon is valid, the others cannot be. So you've got a whole bunch of ways of explaining, if this goes to that, then this is true. And then you rule out the others. The presence of one group of independent variables predicted by one theory precludes others predicted by rival theory. So what we're saying there is, if you've got one way of this happening, the others cannot be true. Now, you may look for simple patterns. Sometimes you may have only a small number of variables, but if you have that situation, they've got to give rise to really different patterns. So you need dramatic differences to allow you to compare. When we're looking for precision, well, you may or may not use quantitative or some form of statistical analysis. You might be setting a criteria or a benchmark. If X happens, sales increase by 10%. Like Christmas, you might say, well, my proposition is Christmas increases sales. Well, you should see that. You may be comparing statements or outcomes from interviews. Try and avoid setting too subtle an outcome, as you've got to make this match. So make it strong and generic and X. If X happens, then you get Y. Let's look at explanation building. To explain means to stipulate causal links. Links may be complex and difficult to measure. Explanations therefore tends towards narratives, towards some form of storytelling. Stronger studies closely reflect your theoretical propositions. So theory proposes this, and we see this in our case, and we tell exactly how we see it. Again, going back to the chain of evidence work earlier on. Multiple cases therefore appear more rigorous to reviewers because you can show repeatedly that this has happened, and that leads to stronger cross-case analysis. You've got to take great care with your explanation building and ensure no rival theory or alternative explanations are possible. Time series studies relate to sequences of events that lead to an outcome. Researchers need to identify the necessary conditions or steps in sequence for an outcome to occur. As with most techniques, there's always overlap with pattern matching. That's fine, you just need to know where you're going to. So you might be looking for a pattern, but actually you're using time series. Simple cases may follow a single or small number of dependent or independent variables that rise or fall over time. So you see an increase in something or a decrease in something over time, and it leads to a certain event. Complex cases may have both rising and falling or even more complicated patterns over time, which lead to an outcome. Now, with time series data, you've got to identify the start and the end points over which you're measuring these variables. That's important because you've got to test these maybe over multiple cases. Chronologies, time series data, usually leads to quite compelling narratives. People like engaging with them. Presenting events as they unfold in chronological order is often insightful, and it's dangerous though, because you can have presumed causal events. This happened first and therefore that. So you've got to be really careful. You need to ensure that chronology is predicted by some theoretical explanation. So really think about what's the theory that explains why A goes to B. Logic models match empirically observed events to theoretically predicted events. Models are often shown as flow diagrams, and we have a nice flow diagram for you to look at here. This is from Yin's book. Interventions by actors lead to outcomes. You may have multiple outcomes. Intermediate outcomes may lead to multiple outcomes. You can actually draw quite complicated flow models, but you can see, in this example, it's about youth behaviour and possible interventions. Youth becomes at risk. We can see do they join a gang? Do they take drugs? How do these things interplay with each other? Do they enter the justice system? And what are the possible outcomes? So we can see this flow diagram helps with the logic. Data collection and organisation again needs to map onto the logic model to test and either support or refute this. So you can see you could do surveys or interviews, all sorts of things looking at this particular case to prove the flow of your logic model. Let's look at cross-case synthesis. This is where you've collected data for multiple instances. You've treated each individual case as a separate study, and then you're aggregating the findings. It may be done using qualitative or quantitative methods. Now, this example here is an illustrative example from some of my own work from, when's that, 2008. The figure shows what's called the UK new product introduction process for aerospace firms. What we did was we studied a whole load of different firms, and there were 45 different companies, and we looked at the way they introduced new products in the company. What was their new product introduction process? And having looked across all of them, we could then aggregate and say, well, generically, this is what the process looks like. These are the steps. This was very useful to see the theoretical process, but also for our partner firms. They could say, oh, we're maybe missing this bit, or we do this bit differently. So it was very useful for everybody involved. key question you're going to be faced with is, do you name people, places, organisations, or do you use pseudonyms, so made up names, or do you leave it anonymous? Naming locations, organisations is a key ethical decision. It's always nice to see the name of a widely known place or organisation because it helps people identify quickly with the context. But is it really necessary for the learning to use real names? Identification can introduce bias. Naming organisations shouldn't help your contribution to theory. It might help you get published if you write a paper about a very large organisation, but it shouldn't make a difference to theory. Identifying people and organisations may create issues for them in the future. This is your ethical and, to be honest, your moral. It's beyond ethics. I think it's more moral concerns for you. You will need written permission to name people, organisations, or places. You'll also need to give people the opportunity to withdraw. Look at the Data Protection Act, the General Data Protection Regulation. You can get into a lot of trouble if you start naming people and they have the right to be forgotten. How do you delete that? The mixtures of named and anonymous may also be problematic, as you've got to be careful not to enable re-identification. So if somebody says, no, I don't want to be named, but you named their organisation and their position, well, it's pretty obvious who they are. And so they can easily be identified. Actually, any 3 points of data can often point to an exact individual. Pseudonyms are useful. Often I have renamed organisations. I tend to pick a theme: Greek gods, planets, which is also often Greek gods, obscure places, places with funny names, and I name my organisations after that. A friend of mine wrote a book on tax law and renamed all the companies after people from Star Wars. So whatever floats your boat, but pseudonyms are a useful way of doing it. So be very aware of the UK laws on personal data, and as well as the European. But Data Protection Act is concerned with personal data, and it's related to any living individual who can be identified. Personal data has to be about a living person, not records about deceased, although such data could still be protected by confidentiality or other legal rules, so be careful. Under Article 17 of the General Data Protection Regulations, individuals have the right to have personal data erased. It's the right to be forgotten. It only applies to data held at the time the request is received and is not absolute and only applies in certain circumstances. Read the exemptions. I've published quite a lot of papers now with companies named in it. I always get permission up front, and it does protect you against this sort of stuff. I tend not to name individuals because I really don't see the point. Your paper needs to stand the test of time. I'm in management, and who was the manager at a particular position? Unless I'm particularly interested in that individual's career, then it's really about what happened because of power, their position of power as opposed to them as an individual. We're always striving for quality in our research. Whatever your approach to case study, you need to try and get the highest quality you can. Before you start, make sure you have rigorous theoretical underpinning to the approach. All data collected in analysis frameworks theoretically underpinned and strong. This is what's going to help you get published. Ensure you have collected and examined all the data available. Don't ignore outliers or areas perceived as too difficult, or you could find that you're susceptible to the alternative interpretations based on the evidence ignored. There's always what's called the black swan example, where if you live in the northern hemisphere, well, all swans are white, but the moment you go to the southern hemisphere, well, black swans suddenly appear. That's always the problem with this sort of case study data collection. There's the example that you missed. Recognize and address any rival interpretations directly. So if you see a potential rival interpretation of your data, write it down, examine it, explore it, pull it apart. It makes your study richer, I always think. Focus on the key issues. You may find many interesting things, but do not go what I call chasing bunnies. That is randomly running all over a field. It's interesting, but it's not going to get your paper finished. Try and focus on what it is you're trying to prove. So here's the task. What is your PhD's research question? What's the theoretical basis of your PhD? What are the propositions of your work? Those items that are proposed. What are the assumptions that you're making within both the propositions and maybe in the research questions? What is your unit of analysis? Micro, meso, macro. Is it people, time? Consider the bounds, the geography, the ethnography. In what context is your research situated? Again, that's about bounding. How will you link theory to practice? What is the lens or framework you might use to answer your research question? So we've got research question, propositions, unit of analysis, logic, and criteria for interpreting findings. So you've started collecting your data, but really you need to think about writing up your research. Let's look at the different ways we write up and how important it is to start writing up now. So our aims: theory, what is case-based research, how does it build theory, when do we use it, and analysis techniques, and then thinking about maybe some application of case examples were our aims. Hopefully you can understand the basics of what a case study is, appreciate the benefits of it, understand maybe the limitations, at least understand how we do it, how to use cases, and understand some of the basic analysis options. So that's the end of this talk through what I hope is a useful summary of Yin's book on case study research. I'd suggest you buy the book. It's a great resource to have. I've tried to summarize it for you. Hopefully you'll find this useful and you can dip in and out of it. Please do stay in touch. This is, again, it's all part of the dialogue. And good luck with your case study research.